So our theme in these talks is being alone together. And yesterday I suggested that the way we today can perhaps best understand what that means, and why it takes us to the heart of the gospel, indeed into the heart of God. Perhaps one of the ways in which we can understand that today with our various afflictions is through loneliness. And I was saying yesterday how we can see loneliness as a characteristic of our developed, affluent societies. The more affluent we become, the greater the degree of loneliness is reported at all stages of life, particularly among the young. And that by understanding the nature of loneliness, not just as a psychological condition and not just as a phenomenon of the 21st century affluent world, but to understand it as part of our human condition, can give us some deep insights. Not just ideas, but insights that change the way our mind actually works. The call of all spiritual practice, the essential call of all religion, is to come to these transformative insights, to be able to see, as Jesus says, to see God with a pure heart. It's not just to have ideas and to have the right ideas and to be orthodox in our beliefs. Those are only guidelines, certain disciplines that may be helpful for us to come to an insight. But a real insight is much more like an experience that changes us, and not just an intellectual experience, but something that we may well feel as a kind of a shock through our body even, when we really have this eureka moment, when we see something that we hadn't seen before. There's a sense of breakthrough, a sense of discovery, a sense of joy, liberation. We're being liberated from ignorance. But that's experiential rather than just intellectual. So I think we can be helped to come to this transformative, redemptive, liberating insight, which could also be the meaning of faith. We come to this by entering into reality as we experience it now, which may not be very pleasant. We may be experiencing life, certainly if we're experiencing it through loneliness, then that is not a pleasant way of starting, but that's where we start from. It's like with every meditation. You don't always start every meditation full of faith and full of hope and full of gratitude that you found this way of prayer. Sometimes you start meditation feeling you'd much rather watch television or have a gin and tonic or, have a nap. So we need to accept and face ourselves every time we meditate just as we are, even though that may not conform to what we think we should be like or what we would like to be like. That's irrelevant. That's basically illusory. Where we have to start is with what we've got, and then see where we go from there. So for many people today, there is the starting point on the spiritual journey, which is not easy. It may be for many people through this experience of loneliness. So it's important to be able to understand what loneliness might mean. And we began to look at that yesterday and to see that it isn't just a psychological, individual, or sociological phenomenon. It's something that's fundamental to human existence. We saw that in the story of Genesis, the creation of the human. So what I'd like to do now is to move a little bit further into this idea of solitude. Solitude as the cure or the healing of loneliness. Loneliness is there. It's like a design fault in the human condition. It's there in some form, integrally. It's there in the human person. It can be more or less activated or more or less severe, but it's there in some form or other. Just our idea of original sin might help to understand that. It doesn't mean we're bad. It doesn't mean that we are condemned. It just means that this is what we are starting from. And once we've actually started from it, you are on the way to that point where you can say, that was a good place to start. Oh, happy fault, as we say in the Easter liturgy at the Easter Vigil, when we tell the whole story of the biblical story of salvation, beginning with Adam and Eve and original sin, and then leading up to the resurrection. And then at that moment, this wonderful phrase appears in the liturgy, "O felix culpa," "O happy fault." Actually, it wasn't very nice at the time, but if it hadn't been for that, we wouldn't have got to where we are. Now, it may take you 30 or 40 years to get to that place, or 3 or 4 millennium, but it doesn't matter. What matters is, as John Main says about meditation, not where you've got to, but that you are on the way. It's a fundamental difference there, that you are on the way. So what I'd like to do is look at a couple of sources of wisdom that can help us to understand this a little better. And one of them is Shantideva. Shantideva was an 7th or 8th century Buddhist monk, often called the Thomas Aquinas of Buddhism. And one of his great works is called the Bodhisattva, the Guide to the Bodhisattva Way of Life. Now, Bodhisattva is a term that refers to, and in particular to an enlightened being, so somebody who has come to this redemptive, transformative insight and is ready to fly off beyond the cycle of death and rebirth into nirvana, into heaven, fully and finally, but holds back. And is held back, or willingly holds him or herself back, because of their awareness of the suffering that is still going on in their fellow human beings. And so they sort of hold back on the brink of disappearing into nirvana. They've earned it, but they say, I'm going to hang in here until all suffering in the world has been transcended. So it's very radical, and we'll see that this is not just a Buddhist ideal, this is something that's very much part of Mahayana Buddhism, the the big wheel Buddhism, as opposed to the Theravada Buddhism, different styles, sort of Catholic and Protestant Buddhism there. But it's also a universal truth. It's a universal insight that we should find, and we will find if we look for it and see it in the gospel itself. But let's just look at what Shantideva says about this. And in the beginning of his great work, the Bodhisattva Guide to the Bodhisattva Way of Life, he speaks about what he calls the awakening mind. We actually, if your mind was awake yesterday, there was a short reading we did at one of the meditation sessions before, just about that. And he's saying the awakening mind has there are two things to say about it. One is that you want to awaken your mind, and you are resolved to do it. So this is a definite choice and a definite intention and commitment. I want to have an awakened mind. So that's the first step. And that may not be an easy step, but that's the first step. But the second step is that you are on the way, that you are actually doing something about it rather than just reading about it or thinking about it or dreaming about it as some kind of spiritual ideal or spiritual goal. You're actually getting into it. So we could say it'd be similar to our approach to meditation. I don't meet many people who you do occasionally, but not very many people who reject meditation entirely. Most people will say they think meditation is a good thing and they would like to be able to do it themselves. But also a lot of people will say, I just can't do it because I'm not a good meditator, because I've got so much going on in my life at the moment, I don't have time. There are all sorts of reasons. And those reasons should be listened to tolerantly and not become a cause of judgment and condemnation of somebody. But if you want to do something, you shouldn't want to do it if you honestly feel you can't do it. Then you say, I can't do it, so I don't want to do it anymore, or I'll wait for another 20 years. But if you really have come to the first step of the awakening mind, and you say, I want to do it, then you'll find a way to do it. It's like somebody at one of our MBA courses who comes in and gives a talk. He's head of a big financial, or has a very high position in a big financial public institution. And he speaks to the MBA students, and they all look up to him as a kind of a role model, and they're happy to have such a celebrity of that world talking to them. And they are amazed when he speaks about meditation and what he has gained from it. But they're even more amazed when he tells them that he meditates every day. And they usually say, but how do you do this? How do you actually do it? And he said, well, it's true. He said, if I come into work, I've got 10 things I've got to do, absolutely urgent things today. But I come into the office and there are 20 emergency critical things that I have to, fires I have to put out immediately. So by the end of the day, maybe most of those 10 things that I wanted to do don't get done. So that's his life, at that level of leadership and management and so on. But he says, so that is my life. But if in the middle of some major crisis, I get a call from the managing director of his institution and says, I need to see you straight away, I don't say, sorry, I haven't got time at the moment. I drop what I'm doing and I go to do it. It's very much what St. Benedict says about prayer. We're becoming very familiar with the bells of the monastery. Well, the bells are a signal, a call to prayer. And Benedict says, when you hear that bell, you drop what you're doing in the middle of an email or the middle of something, you're making a cup of coffee, and you go. So this is what this man says to the students. The meditation for him has now become part of his life in this way, he says, and you just make time for it. You just have to. So he's transitioned from wanting to have an awakened mind to having an awakening mind. And that doesn't mean he's arrived there yet, but he's on the way. So this is the first thing that Shantideva says about the way, let's say, to the goal that we are concerned with in these talks. At the heart of this decision and of this active decision, putting it into practice, is the central idea of any true path of enlightenment, which is a concern for the welfare of others, not for your own enlightenment. Now, there is a concern for your own enlightenment, because otherwise you wouldn't be doing it. And it's a concern maybe to transcend loneliness and discover solitude. But actually, the deeper, the stronger, the more dominant concern should be for the welfare of others. That's the teaching of the gospel, and it's the teaching of Shantideva here. Shantideva says that this isn't as easy as it sounds. And in order to be able to commit yourself to engage with that higher or deeper concern for the welfare of others, given the fact that you're starting from where we are starting, which may be a place of suffering and confusion or even despair. And one of the terrible things about any form of suffering is that it tends to focus you and to lock you into yourself, whether it's toothache or any other kind of psychological or mental suffering. It just hurts, and it's I who am hurting. There's nothing bad in that, except that self-fixation that suffering inevitably creates makes it worse. It increases the suffering, which is why we go into a spiral, and why we need help to get out of it, to pull ourselves out of the nosedive. Certain kinds of suffering, and loneliness is a very good example of it. So, what we're advised is, take refuge, is the Buddhist expression, take refuge in those who embody it, who embody this awakening mind. What does it mean to take refuge? Well, in the Christian understanding, it's essentially being a disciple, following the Lord. So we take refuge, we embrace the gift of the teacher wherever we find it, and it comes to us as grace, and it comes to us very often in the darkest moments of our suffering. So, this is the goal, this is the roadmap, these are the first two steps, to want it, and then to actually do something about it, to start your practice. But then you pretty quickly run into obstacles, which we'll look at in a moment, and which is why many people give up meditation after a few failed attempts. So we need to take refuge. We need to find those other human beings with whom we can identify. I'm not talking just about guru worship. That can be a mistake, that can be a fault in itself. The Christian idea is, of course, that we take refuge in Jesus, but Jesus is not found only in a sort of privatized one-to-one, online dating type of relationship, but is found in the community, in the mystical body, in those with whom we are actually making the journey, who look just as messed up, as inconstant, as unfaithful, and as unbalanced as we are. But in some way, we experience and find within that body of people the one who embodies what we are seeking. So we have to take refuge. In that commitment to the work, we discover solitude. No one can meditate for you. You can meditate, however, with other people. And so in the process of learning to meditate, we discover both solitude and community together, like two sides of the euro. And the solitude is that I have to accept my own unique identity, my own personal commitment. No one can do this on my behalf. I can't delegate it to anybody else. And at the same time, as soon as we have made this commitment, we discover that we are in a community of fellow workers, that other people like ourselves, stumbling, making mistakes, not perfect people, but we are in that community, and in the communion of that community, there is something that transcends and embodies the very goal that we are aiming for. And this, according to Shantideva, is the way we find the source of joy. This is just exactly how we find it. Not by looking for something outside of ourselves, something new that we can gain, own, control, possess, not some fulfillment of a desire externally, but we find this source of joy within this the spinning coin of solitude and community. And above all, we find it in the desire to relieve the suffering of others. This is the seed of true happiness, he tells us. Now, we may well feel that even hearing that is a little depressing because we don't feel we're there yet. We don't feel so altruistic, so generous, so concerned about the needs of others. I've got so many problems and concerns of my own, I just can't do it. I can't be as selfless and as other-centered as I would like. Well, that's where you start. That's precisely it. We're not there yet. But we can see enough of it to be able to know or to trust that that is the starting point, and that's the way we have to go. If we can, so it's the same with meditation, and meditation is a very accurate expression of this theme. We meditate with all our failings and imperfections and distractions and inconstancy. Nevertheless, we come back to it, we stay on the path. So this seed of true happiness, which is what the gospel calls the kingdom, is already within us. It's already part of our universe. It's such that we haven't quite awakened to it yet. But we have some sense that it is there calling us. And that's really what we mean by interiority. Interiority doesn't mean some kind of lonely, hidden, introverted place. It really means that what we are looking for is already there in our life. And that is the message of the gospel with regard to the kingdom. It's what the kingdom means. The kingdom is within you, Jesus says, and the kingdom is among you, Jesus says. And the kingdom is not far from you, Jesus says. We cannot observe the kingdom. We can't stand outside of it because we're just too close to it, or we are already, in a sense, within it, waiting to awaken to it. And this awakening mind, according to Shantideva, is like a tree that constantly bears fruit, even when we fail and forget and fall off the path. So we don't have to be perfect at this. In fact, to think that we should be perfect is almost as bad as thinking that we are perfect. So all we have to commit ourselves to is the step of faith, which we continually repeat.